Well, we're going to turn to the scriptures to Genesis chapter 18, and we'll commence to read at verse 1. Genesis 18 and verse 1. And the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door, and bowed himself toward the ground, and said, My Lord, if now I have found favour in thy sight, pass not away, I pray thee, from thy servant. Let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will fetch a morsel of bread, and comfort ye your hearts. After that ye shall pass on. For therefore are ye come to your servant? And they said, So do as thou hast said. And Abraham hastened into the tent unto Sarah, and said, Make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes upon the hearth. And Abraham ran unto the herd, and fetched a calf tender and good, and gave it unto a young man, and he hasted to dress it. And he took butter and milk and a calf which he had dressed, and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. And they said unto him, Where is Sarah thy wife? And he said, Behold, in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life, and lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, After I am waxed old shall I have pleasure, my Lord, being old also. And the Lord said unto Abraham, Wherefore did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I of a surety bear a child which am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the time appointed I will return unto thee according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not. For she was afraid, and he said, Nay, but thou didst laugh. And the men rose up from thence and looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring them on the way. And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do, saying that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him. And the Lord said, Because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me, and if not, I will know. And the men turned their faces from thence and went toward Sodom, but Abraham stood yet before the Lord. And may God bless to our hearts again this morning his own precious word. Just to recap where we left off last Lord's Day morning, we were noticing last Sunday as to how Abraham had a fresh revelation from God. What has happened is he's been living in a home that is a very messed up home, a home where Sarah was responsible and Hagar was responsible, and also Abraham was responsible for their actions. There's been the birth of Ishmael, and we find that for 13 years that God hasn't spoken, or there's no record of God speaking to Abraham. There's 13 years in a home of contention, and we did cover last week as to how God came and he revealed himself as the El Shaddai, the all-sufficient, the Almighty One. And he says to Abraham, I'm going to change your name, and I'm also going to change the name of Sarah. And we did dwell a little last week with the name of Sarah, that her name, first of all, Sarai, it meant contentious. And no doubt in that home there was a lot of contention, there was a lot of conflict, there was a lot of bitterness. And then Abram's name was going to be changed to Abraham, which was the father of a nation, or the father of a multitude. But every time that this family looked at this young boy, Ishmael, the conflict seemed to be very much on the surface. And eventually, well, after 13 years, God is going to speak again. I did also dwell last Sunday morning on the fact that the story of the Israelites leaving the land of Egypt, that God gave to them the request, but he sent leanness into their soul. And I said, whenever we are bent on getting our own way, God could say, well, you have it. You go down that route, but with that there will be leanness of soul. And that is an absolute tragedy. We also noticed as to how the Solomon, who had 1,000 wives, he said he'd rather dwell in the housetops than to live in the house with a contentious woman. And so inside this home here and inside this family, there was an awful lot of conflict. We also noticed as to how God did bless Ishmael. We noticed that in some length, that God fulfilled his word. But I want us this morning to approach chapter 18 and to notice that one day there's 3 men arrives at the door of the tent. Now Abraham is not living in a house that you and I live in, or that type of house. He's living in a tent. And I think of my best experiences that I had whenever I went to Israel 30 years ago now, in April or just about this time. One of my best experiences was going out to visit the Bedouins in the tent, because we were instructed that these people lived the way that Abraham did. After we arrived at the tent, I remember well as to how they killed a few chickens. They got some rice cooked, and everybody tore in with their fingers, no knives or forks, and everybody helped themselves. And what they were doing is they were entertaining strangers. And the Bible tells us that we ought not to be forgetful to entertain strangers, because there have been those that have entertained angels unawares. I think it's a sad reflection on society today, and I realize, of course, the implications that there are whenever a stranger arrives at our door. Some of you will have maybe had in your home, we had, it must be a year or so ago, a young Jewish boy that was round selling paintings. And we invited him into the house. My wife offered him a cup of tea. He wouldn't accept it because, of course, he wasn't going to eat in the house of a Gentile. But we're told here that this man here, he was entertaining heavenly visitors. I think it's true to say that we all wear different coats or different hats at times. We all are aware that maybe that there are those of you, and maybe you could be a Sunday school teacher this morning. You could also wear the hat of being a mother. You could wear the hat of being a wife. I realised this morning that we all have different hats. We have the hat maybe of a pastor, the hat maybe of a friend, the hat maybe of helping out in some other way. And in this story, I noticed that Abraham and also Sarah, they're wearing different hats or different coats, maybe we want to use that term. It may be maybe in the workplace that you use it. I know now with employment rights and all, maybe you will say, well, that's not part of my job, it's not part of my contract to do that. But one thing that I learned whenever I was studying, because I was interested in it, A-level psychology, that the one important thing, one word to describe leadership is adaptability. If we're not willing to adapt to a changing situation around us, well, then we will run into very big problems. And I know of those good friends of mine that left the ministry because they couldn't look at blood. And they couldn't visit a hospital. They just couldn't adapt to that situation. And they left the work of God. But you and I will find that in life we have to adapt to different aspects of our work. I want to entitle this morning, The Outcome of Faith and the Life of Abraham and Sarah. In this passage we see the adaptability in Abraham's life. And the question that you and I have to ask ourselves is, what is the outcome of faith in our lives? You've heard me say umpteen times, making reference to our late matron in Bible College, Miss Annie Wilson. Why I do that is because I believe she left an impression upon many of our lives. But she used to emphasize to us the importance of Christianity being worked out to the fingertips. There was one thing to stand in the pulpit, it was one thing for others to see us stand in the pulpit, but unless that Christianity has been worked out to the fingertips, well then it's not a very much good, really. And I want us to ask ourselves and to seek to answer the question this morning as to what is the outcome of faith in our lives. We're saved by faith. How does it affect our everyday living? And we find some answers here in Genesis chapter 18. What difference does it make in our lives that we profess Christianity? Does others take knowledge that we have been with Christ? You know, I'm sure that we are all too aware in the Lord's work at times that we ought never to lay an awful lot of emphasis, really, whenever someone, and I preach to myself today, even stands in a pulpit. Because someone stands in a pulpit is no indication as to their spirituality. None whatsoever. We'd rather see a sermon, someone said, than hear one any day. And here we find in the first 8 verses the story of Abraham's faith, and then in verses 9 to 15 how Sarah's faith was going to work its way out. Abraham has had a fresh encounter with God. Let me ask you again, dear friends, from this time last week, as to our encounters with God. Have we gone through the mechanics of a quiet time? I said last Sunday it was very difficult to do. It is difficult to do, just to sit in God's presence and not to pray at all, just to listen to see what God has got to say to us. That is a difficult thing to do. The outcome of this story here is that 3 men arrive at the tent door, and these men have arrived from nowhere. And Abraham sitting as the midday, as the heat of the day, and he's sitting relaxing in the tent door, and he lifts up his eyes and he looks and he sees that there's 3 men standing by him. And we notice what he did was he ran out to meet these strangers. And we find that here's a man, Abraham, and the first coat that he's going to wear is the coat of a servant. And we know that in the East that was important whenever a guest would arrive, that there would be the washing of feet. And it was a symbol, of course, as to the welcome that these people were going to receive. Now we may ask ourselves, and I'm sure we're too aware this morning, as to who these 3 strangers are that has arrived at this man's tent door. And one is Christ himself, as a pre-incarnation of Christ. And the other 2 are angels, and they've arrived at this man's door. And they have a message to give to him. It seems to be that Abraham recognized the heavenly origin of the guests, because he springs into action, and right away he wants to serve these 3 strangers that has arrived. And I think by way of passing by this morning that the one thing that we have to learn is that you never know when the Lord will show up at our place. I'm sure that particular day, as Abraham sitting in the tent door, he's not expecting the Lord just to show up there and then. I wonder, dear friends, would there be anything that we would be embarrassed about, or we wouldn't want the Lord to notice if he was to show up at our homes today? If he was to be listening to our conversation throughout this day? This man here, he's sitting in the tent door, and the Lord arrives with these 2 heavenly angels. And in the first 6 verses we find the quickness of his ministry here. He springs into action, and speedily he wants to meet the needs of these heavenly visitors. Now, you and I have to stop for a moment and remind ourselves, this man is 100. He's not in his 40s, and he's not in his 30s, or he's not even in his 60s or his 70s, but this man is 100. And he's sitting relaxing in the tent door, and these visitors has arrived, and we're told as to what this man did was he actually runs out to meet them. Now, maybe you and me could pray that if we ever reached 100 that we'd be able to walk still. But here's a man and he's running at 100. There's still seems to be a bit of a spark within this man here. And there's the quickness of his ministry. He recognizes here that it's his duty, and he sets about as quickly as possible to fulfill his duty as a servant. You know, the Lord deserves to come first in our lives. He deserves the best service that you and I can give him. Now, Abraham's sitting in the tent door. I'll say it again, dear friends, because maybe living in the West here, we're not as familiar as to this tent and this goat skin that there would have been in the middle of the tent, because the women sat on one side of the tent and the men on the other side. But Abraham at this particular time is sitting in the doorway. And we find here that his faith, it involved haste and it involved humility. He's probably surprised to see them in the middle of the day, because the middle of the day is very, very hot. And you know that in Israel and many other places, in the middle of the day, the shops and all close for a few hours, because that is it's too warm to work. And people will go and they'll take their afternoon nap. But that hasn't happened this particular day here. It's very hot, and well, in the midst of it all, this man, he runs and he takes on the hat of a servant, and we're told, we see his reverence, he bows down. Now, we know that this was an oriental welcome, but I would have an idea that within Abraham's heart, he realizes there's something strange here in the middle of the day to see these strange visitors arriving at a time whenever most people would be having that nap. And then we read as to how it all starts to unfold. We're told in verse 7 that Abraham ran unto the herd. He seems to be doing nothing but run here. He has run out, first of all, in verse 2, he ran to meet them from the tent door, and then he runs unto the herd. I think it's lovely to see people, if they reach this great advanced age, to see that the way that this man here at 100 is still coping. We notice with regard to the heavenly visitors that he accepts them immediately. We notice that he assumes responsibility personally. He doesn't send his servants. The only one that he's asking for help is Sarah, his wife. And so there's the ministry to strangers. I would say that his service was going to be sacrificial, because he was going to run out here and he was going to select a tender calf from his herd. Whenever we were entertained by the Bedouins, there was 3 chickens we had. First time I ever ate goat, it was in Israel. But this particular time here, it was this tender calf that was going to be fetched. It was sacrificial. Someone has said this here: you haven't really become a servant until your service costs you personally. I wonder today in our service for the Lord, what does it cost us? It may cost you your time, it may cost you your talents, it may cost you your possessions, it may cost you your family, it may cost you a friendship. But you haven't really become a servant until your service is costing you personally. In Romans 12:1, I prayed it earlier on there, that we might present our bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is our reasonable service. And in verse 7 and 8, we're told here that Abraham, he goes and he gets this calf here, and he gives it unto a young man, and then he's going to get it ready for cooking, and he takes some butter and milk and the calf, and then he's going to present it to these heavenly visitors, and he's going to sit back and he's going to wait. Which I find here in these 3 verses here, there's the quietness of his ministry. I was visiting someone this week, and they passed the remark to me as to how that it's not always the man that is in the pulpit that does the most for the work of God. And this is a man that I love in the Lord. a very faithful man in the house of God here over many, many years. But he's not able to get out to the house of God any longer. And I said to him, that's true. You could be sitting in the back pew. You may never ever reach the pulpit, but you could do far more for the work of God, quietly. And Abraham here, there's the quietness of his ministry, because while the visitors were eating the meat, Abraham, he stands quietly beside them to see is there anything else that they need. What a powerful testimony. What a powerful ministry. I was looking up there one day. Our brother Ted has said to me on numerous occasions about one of the great gifts that are mentioned in the Word of God, and it is a tremendous gift. I've never actually preached on it, but I intend to maybe sometime. It is the gift of helps. Helps. That's a tremendous gift. So many people want the gift of speaking in tongues and want the gift of doing many different things, but Paul talks amongst all that big list of the ministry of gifts, the gifts of helps. Where would the work of God be today if it wasn't for the gift of helps? Those that do something for the cause and for the work of God. I'm glad, dear friend, that that is a gift that I believe has been very evident here. My sister that was over from England, she was over here last Sunday night, and she passed a remark back round at our house afterwards. And I thought, well, isn't that remarkable? She said, I went into the toilet before I came into the service last Sunday night, and she says, I tell you one thing, your toilets are shining. I thought, well, if nobody ever bothered to clean things, people would notice. But sometimes people are more slower, maybe, to notice whenever things are done, even behind the scenes. I thought that was a tremendous compliment to the church and to those that do those jobs. The quietness of the ministry. Imagine the reaction of Abraham's servants as they watched him assume the role of a servant. I was reading the story yesterday about Robert Morrison, who was a missionary to China. And Robert Morrison, whenever he was a missionary to China, he wrote a letter to his friends back in England asking for an assistant. He felt he needed somebody to help him in the work on mainland China. And in response, there was a young man from the country that responded, and he offered himself. And the next thing was he had to come before the panel and he had an interview. In this panel, they said to him, we don't doubt the fact that you're an earnest Christian, but you're too rough and you're too unpolished to go to China as a missionary. But what we'll do is we'll do this here. We don't think we can send you to China as a missionary, but if you're willing to go out as a servant to the missionary, then we will send you. This young man that responded, this young man from the country, he said, well, sir, if the gentleman don't think me fit to be a missionary, I'll go out as a servant. And he says, I'll cut wood for the missionaries and I'll draw water for the missionaries. And I'll do the most menial tasks for the missionaries, if that's what this panel thinks that I should do. And he went out and he worked as a servant. That young man became Dr. Minley, who was one of the best known missionaries in the land of China. What happened to him? He took on the cloak of being a servant. That quiet ministry behind the scenes. You see, real servants of God are those who make themselves available to God and to the work of God. How does faith affect our lives? How does others react whenever they see us? I was down here in the church last night, and I heard a bit of a racket. Whenever I was round in my background, I heard a bit of a racket round at the side of the church, and so I thought I'd go out to investigate, rightly or wrongly. And I went out, and I had a wee word with, there was a young man standing out there, and I had a wee word with him. I knew the young man was absolutely full of drink. And I spoke to him, lovely young fellow. And you know what he said to me? And I thought, well, there's a foundation there somewhere in your life. He said to me, I believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. And he was absolutely full. And I asked him where he was from, and he says, well, I'm from Mackerfeld. And I thought to myself, well, there's somebody to pray for. There's a young man full. He needs help. He needs somebody to get alongside him, whoever he is. But he must have come through some Sunday school or he's learned something about the things of God whenever he even used those words. And dear friend, our faith can work out into the nitty-gritties of help. Some of us have to stop, and I do too at times, and remember where we came from. Remember that there, but for the grace of God, go any of us. Oh, I know that maybe we could say, oh, we ought to come down heavy and do this, that, or the other thing, and I appreciate that, but that was a young man who needed help. I was coming through town last night, and I know that Jonathan and different ones were out giving out tracts, and I thought to myself last night coming through town, the young ones are drunk now, much younger. I guarantee you I met young ones last night that are no more than 14 and they couldn't walk. What do they need? They need somebody to lift them up and to show them the way. That brings me then to this woman, Sarah. And I want you to notice what Sarah did and what God said to her. You see, Sarah's inside the tent and she's listening to the conversation. Did you ever try to listen to somebody else's conversation? Maybe somebody's in a room and they're talking on the phone, and I don't know whether you actually listen to the conversation or not. Or maybe somebody's trying to talk to you and you're trying to listen to see what everybody else is talking about. I don't know what brought it into my mind whenever I was preparing this during the week, but I thought of whenever I was growing up, and maybe some of you older people can identify with this, that maybe there was a strange letter or something arrived at your house. There's no emails or nothing. I remember maybe my mother thinking, her curiosity got the best of her, how do I actually know who this letter's from? You get the kettle out and get it boiling, set the letter on it, and I reckon, mind you, by the paralinguistics of some of you today, that you've done the exact same thing. And very, very nicely, you've folded it open to see who it's from, and you've sealed it up again, and you've said to yourself, so they'll never know I even opened it in the first place. And that way you want to see, and I appreciate that, and I don't say it critically of my mother or anything, but I'm sure there's many a time maybe that we have been tempted to do the same. But I say this, dear friend, that Sarah, she's listening here to the conversation, and she wants to know actually who these men are, what's happening. After all, her husband has said, go and get this meal ready and get the cakes baked on the hearth for these visitors. But not only does Sarah listen, but Sarah laughs. Now, Sarah's 90. And these heavenly visitors, they have a message for Sarah again, and the message is, Sarah, you're going to bring forth a child. Now, she's 90. And she's probably riddled with arthritis. And maybe she's bent over. We don't know. But after all, she's 90 years of age. And the message, and Sarah just thinks to herself, well, look here, I've been married for 70 years. There's been no children. This is all too much for me to cope with now. And so Sarah has a good laugh to herself. But the Bible tells us she didn't laugh outwardly, she laughed inwardly. And that was the important thing that we notice here, that she laughed in verse 13. In verse 12 we also read, therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I am waxed old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? After all, my husband's 100 and I'm 90. This is absolutely ridiculous. And she laughs. But then you see, dear friends, we read there in verse 13, the Lord said unto Abraham, remember, he was one of the visitors. Why? Why does Sarah laugh? Now, Sarah hadn't giggled outwardly. Sarah had laughed inwardly. There was no evidence outwardly that Sarah had laughed. She had laughed within herself. But we notice, dear friends, as to what happened here. Sarah must have known in her heart that her laughter was wrong. But she gets very defensive to the Lord, and in verse 13, then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. She's very defensive. And so what she's actually doing now is she lies to the Almighty God. She's afraid of the consequences. You see, Sarah had to give an account as to her laughter right there on the spot. I don't know what Sarah must have felt that day. She must have felt, here's somebody, and he sees actually what's going on inside my heart here. I've stood here and I've said, but I didn't laugh. And he said, no, you did laugh. He has seen the inward thoughts of this woman here. And Hebrews 11 tells us eventually, because after this was said to her, but you did laugh, in verse 15. We don't know what actually starts to unfold after that until we go over to the book of Hebrews, and we're told that by faith she conceived because she judged him faithful who had promised her. There's no sin too big for God to forgive. But I wonder afterwards, what did Abraham and Sarah talk about after these visitors left? And I made reference to it last Lord's Day evening, that for you and I that are saved, that one day we will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And I used the illustration, I said about how the internet seems to have pulled everything together, and how that if you type in something into the internet, you seem to get an awful lot of information. And I know that with the Freedom of Information Act, there's an awful lot that is accessible today that wouldn't have been a few years ago. And what I said was last Sunday night that I typed in a name into the Google search engine with regard to somebody. I was not looking at the information that I found on the internet, and so after I read a wee bit, I got tired of it and I pushed it aside. But I typed in the name of a former businessman in Cookstown here because I wanted to find out a particular thing, and I got pages and pages and pages about this one person. And I'll say this, dear friend, on that great judgment day, whenever we stand before the judgment seat, we may stand up and we may say to God, well, look here, I didn't do this, I didn't do that. But the records will show different. And God read Sarah's mind that day, and he says to her, but look here, Sarah, is there anything too hard for the Lord? You know, faith in our lives that doesn't produce good works in our lives, that faith is useless. We covered this some time ago there in James 2:15. If a brother or sister be naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you say unto them, depart in peace, be ye warmed and filled, notwithstanding ye give them not those things that are needful to the body, what doth it profit? If our Christianity is not worked out to the fingertips. With this, I'll conclude this morning. Faith doesn't focus on the problems. Faith focuses on the promises of God. And if you're living a life of faith today and you're walking by faith, faith ought not to focus on the problems. It ought to focus on the promises. Faith ought to work through the challenges of life. Faith rests on the promises of the Word of God. And after all this here, God is going to come to Sarah. We know that the same word was used whenever Mary was told she was going to have a child. In Luke's Gospel 1:37, there's going to be nothing too hard for the Lord. Jeremiah 32:17 tells us there's nothing too hard for you. And dear friends, finally, and with this I'm through today, faith that serves others serves Christ. I'll say that again. Faith that serves others serves Christ. We're going to sing our closing hymn.